Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. North Carolina's judges are chosen by voters in partisan elections, just like any other politician. But should judges have Democratic or Republican labels next to their names on the ballot? Some state lawmakers say it's time to take party labels out of judicial elections. WRAL state government reporter Will Doran examined the issue, and he joins us now. Will, always good to see you.
Thank you.
North Carolina is unlike many states in that it elects its judges, right?
Yes, not every state does it exactly the same, but a lot of states don't elect their judges at all. And of course, federal judges are not elected either. But here in North Carolina, we elect plenty of offices, and that includes our judges.
And why is that?
Well, there's been a feeling for, decades, centuries in North Carolina that government is more responsive when it is directly answering to the people of the state. That, if you don't have people appointed to powerful positions, if you have the voters selecting who they want to be in charge, then you have a more responsive government.
Now, a group of Democratic lawmakers wants to tweak that just a little bit. What do they want to do?
Yes, they want to take partisanship out of the equation, essentially. Now, you might say, well, that seems like it's impossible in this day and age.
Well, what would it look like?
Just literally on the ballot, no longer would you say this candidate is a Democrat, this candidate is a Republican. It would just, that would just be blank. Normally when you go to vote for people, you can see that. That wouldn't exist for the judicial races if this bill becomes law.
Now, judges are supposed to be impartial, but this push comes sort of as there have been several political lawsuits in the state, and one that seems to be sort of a perfect storm of politics in the courts right now, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anyone who has followed state politics in the last couple months knows about this Jefferson Griffin versus Allison Riggs versus the State Board of Elections lawsuit over the 2024 race for state Supreme Court. Riggs, she's the Democratic incumbent on the Supreme Court. She appears to have won that race by just a handful of votes, but Griffin is suing and trying to have tens of thousands of ballots thrown out. And really at every stage of this process, whether it was at the State Board of Elections or in state court or in federal court, all of the rulings on this have broken down almost entirely along party lines. And this is not a one-off kind of thing. I mean, we've seen tons of rulings from our state's appellate courts in recent years under both Republican and Democratic control. When they look at a lawsuit that has big political implications, the rulings almost always come down exactly on party lines.
And I would imagine that sort of feeds into the sentiment around the judiciary, not just at the state level, right?
Yes. There has been polling on this. Gallup has polled people on their faith in the courts every year since 2006. And they found that 2024 was the worst ever. And it was really a sharp drop-off in just the last couple of years. Back in 2006, around 60% of people said that they trusted the courts. In 2020, around 60% of people trusted the courts. It was pretty stable, for most of recent history that, more than half of people had, solid confidence in the court system. But just in the last 2, 3, 4 years, it has just plummeted. It's now down to basically only a third of Americans say that they are confident in our courts.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear what one former North Carolina justice has to say about this push to make North Carolina's judicial elections nonpartisan. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporter Will Doran about judicial elections in North Carolina. Well, Democrats haven't always wanted nonpartisan elections, right? There's some history there, right?
Yeah. North Carolina was really a one-party state for well over a century. And from, 1868, when we, redid our Constitution after the Civil War, up until, the early 2000s, Democrats ran things and they were in favor of partisan judicial elections because they wanted to tell people that, hey, this person's a Democrat and you should vote for him. But then things started changing after, the civil rights movement, the Reagan Revolution of the 80s. And then in the 90s, the early 2000s, Republicans started winning some judicial elections. Voters said, thank you for telling me this person's a Republican. I'm going to vote for them. And so the Democrats still controlled the legislature at that point. They said, hey, we need to get rid of this and make judicial elections nonpartisan. So they changed it. And then, of course, Republicans flipped control of the legislature. They changed it back. So it has really gone back and forth, really in the last few decades.
How do Republicans feel about this push, especially now that they're winning more judicial races?
Republicans are very happy with the system as it is right now. Almost every single statewide judicial election since they changed the rules to put it back to partisan elections has gone in favor of Republicans. There's been a handful that the Democrats have won, but well over 90% of the time, Republicans are winning these statewide judicial elections for the Supreme Court, for the Court of Appeals. And so there is just less than zero appetite at the state legislature for really making this change that the Democrats are pushing for.
And how are they characterizing this push?
They say that, it is on brand for the Democrats was the quote that the spokesman for the state Republican Party told me. He said, Democrats realize that they are out of touch with the average North Carolinian, that their candidates are too extreme, and that's why they're losing these judicial elections, and that's why they want voters to not know which party the candidates belong to.
What are other ways that states choose judges and justices, and are they any better?
Well, there's pros and cons, as with anything. There's no perfect system, of course. Like I said at the beginning, we liked to elect offices here in North Carolina, including for judges, because the feeling is that that makes it more responsive to the people. But in plenty of other states, judges are appointed. And, sometimes that can be political, but sometimes it can be apolitical. You can have just the governor or just the legislature appointing judges, or you can have a big mix of people. You can have committees who are named to appoint judges. You can have, the State Bar Association involved, and try to take politics out of it to get really the most competent, respected lawyers you can on the bench instead of just who's the best at running a political campaign.
Now, voters tend to be pretty well educated about races at the top of the ticket, but maybe not so much about the ones that are down ballot. Would nonpartisan races cause them to do more research? And if so, do you think they'd actually do it?
Well, that is one argument in favor of making this nonpartisan, is that because voters wouldn't have just that R or that D next to somebody's name that they can look at and make their decision on, they'd have to actually look up the qualifications of these judges. But in practice, that's just not realistic. I actually crunched the numbers for this. In that Griffin-Riggs Supreme Court race in 2024, there were about maybe 100 to 200,000 people in the state who voted for the president but did not vote for Supreme Court. And that's a small percentage of the 5.7 million people who voted. But the last year that we had nonpartisan judicial elections back in 2016, there was 1 million people who voted for president and did not vote in that year's state Supreme Court race. So clearly when these races are nonpartisan and you don't have that R or that D on the ballot, people aren't really doing the research. They're just either skipping that race entirely or, voting, based on whatever limited information they do have.
Now, you spoke with former state Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr. He was a Republican justice before leaving his party and going unaffiliated. What did he tell you?
Yeah, Justice Orr told me that it is, quote, a terrible idea to elect judges in partisan elections. He also said that it's probably just as bad of an idea to elect judges in nonpartisan elections. He ran many partisan races. He was actually one of the reasons why Democrats in the legislature changed the rules back in the 2000s, was because he and some other Republicans kept winning races. And he said, look, even when it was technically nonpartisan, tons of money was still flowing into these races from the state political parties. There was a lot of, organizing politically around the candidates. Even if they were, supposed to be nonpartisan, things were still very politicized in those races. So he said the big question that North Carolina needs to look at is not just what do we do about how judges are presented on the ballot, but the broader question of how should we actually be picking our judges.
Now, the Democrats' push for nonpartisan election looms as we move ahead with this legal battle over the state Supreme Court seat. What would be the most impartial panel to hear that case?
Well, that is a great question. I mean, everyone in that case has different ideas on who should be hearing it, whether it should be in state court or federal court. I don't know at this point if there is a truly impartial panel that exists to hear this thing. I think just what you have to look for in the court system is, especially in a case like this, it usually goes through a lot of layers of judges and justices all, making decisions. And, that's what the system is that we have. And, I should note that part of this too, North Carolina has some of the most expensive races for Supreme Court in the country. I mean, tens of millions of dollars are pouring into these races. So, and it's not just, local money, it's national money too. So people recognize the importance of political control of the courts.
Do these Democratic bills stand any chance in this Republican legislature?
No.
Well, what happens next with them?
They get sent to committee to die, and maybe the Democrats will want to do a press conference or something like that, pushing for it. But like I said before, Republicans are winning under the system that they have right now. But more than that, they say, look, this is just better for transparency. It's better for voters. They point to the stats that I mentioned earlier, how many more people are participating in these elections. They say the fact that more, another extra million people are now voting in the Supreme Court race should encourage people that partisan elections of judges are a good idea, because you don't just have people who, you shouldn't do this, but some people do, just, kind of randomly fill out a name on the ballot. Now they at least have something that gives them some indication of how the judge that they're voting for or against might rule on something.
Will, thanks for breaking it down.
Thank you.
That's WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran. For his in-depth reporting on judicial elections, go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.